I'm pleased to introduce Don Marenzi. Um, Don grew up being fascinated by just about anything that was related to trains, railroads, and the industries they served. He's a rail fan, a historian, a photographer, a preservationist, and a model railroader. He was an early SN3 modeler, but realized there was not enough hours in the day to build everything for an SN3 copper ore hauling operations oriented layout based in Alaska. So Don's Copper Pass and Western is an HO standard gauge railroad. However, Don did not lose interest in narrow gauge though, deciding bigger was better. And this played into how Don usually describes himself, which is mostly historian. He's currently the Society for the Preservation of Carter Railroad Resources, SPCRR, General Manager of Railroad Operations at Ardenwood Farm in Fremont, California. Don's here tonight to tell us about the SPCRR, who they are, what they've done, their future plans, and how you can get involved. Don, we appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you for letting me present this. The museum I represent has kind of flown under the radar for about 40 years. And the way we started, this is what can happen when you get a local historian gets together with a few other people of local interest, and then a bunch of model railroaders get involved. In the 1970s, Bruce McGregor, who's written a number of books on the South Pacific coast, got together with some local historians and rescued a former South Pacific coast caboose body to be restored for display. In the early 1980s, a number of model railroaders got involved. Some of you may have known the late Jojo Hansen, who had a beautiful ON3 Lake Tahoe Railway in the Bay Area here. And myself, Brooke Rother, Rich Nielsen, John Stutz were all regulars up there. We got involved with the project at Ardenwood. And once the railroad started, a couple of other well-known modelers, Bob Schlechter and Jack Burgess, got involved. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Jack's wife, Jackie, who has been one of the long-term volunteers also. We are a small group of volunteers, and again, the subject of our museum is a little more obscure than some of the more popular places. We're located at Ardenwood Farm, which is 205 acres. It opened in the early 1980s. It's a farm representative of 1900 and before, barnyard, blacksmith, farm animals. We have deer, birds, even bald eagles lately. Our group puts together a representative local train ride, and we also host special events and do historical interpretation of railroad subjects. The current ride is half a mile each way, and in a few weeks, we're going to be opening our new extension out to the car barn and restoration area. We currently run from the park entrance to Deer Park Station, run around the train, and go back to the front to Ardenwood Depot. Later this year, we're going to be opening the new loop, and hopefully in the future we'll have interpretive events, and there'll be other displays out in that end of the park. Also at the farm is the Patterson House, which was the prior owner of this ranch before it became part of the park system. I need to tell you a little about the history of Carter Brothers in the South Pacific coast, since those aren't as well-known railroads. Basically, the Carters started building wooden railroad cars, mainly for the narrow gauge market when the narrow gauge boom had started. They built for a lot of small, short lines, basically farmer-owned railroads that were trying to fight the Central Pacific freight rate monopoly here in the West. What generally happened is within a few years, the Central Pacific, Southern Pacific would take over those railroads. The cars that Carter built migrated to a number of other railroads, second, third, fourth hand, and then many had extended lives as sheds, goat pens, etc. When we first started, doing this, there were a lot of rumors that Carter had built a lot more equipment. In fact, we kind of joked that there was a rumor every wood car west of Denver, but that's certainly not true in that. As we researched more, we found out that the legend is far larger than the facts in quantity. People said 10 to 20,000 cars. Right now, to be honest, we're sure of about 2,600. Probably 3,000 would have been about the outside thing. I'll give you an example of how the Carter name, because it's been published, and a lot of model railroaders also bring this up in their articles. But at the top right, you'll see an early photo of West Side. There's two flat cars in the photo. The one on the far right is a Carter Brothers flat car. The one next to the locomotive is either a Hammond or a shop-built flat car. As far as we know, West Side had 317 24-foot wood flat cars in its history. Carter built the first 16 of them, all of which had stake pockets. None of the other cars had stake pockets that were built by Hammond, by Russell, and later by the West Side shop. Yet I can't count how many photos I've seen in books, magazine articles, or online that will show a 24-foot West Side flat car and say it's a Carter car. Again, the legend is a little out of hand on that. Carter did good woodworking. The cars were relatively lightweight. They did some standard gauge work and did dabble in the horse car transit type vehicles, cable cars, and a few electric cars. The photo in the bottom is a 42-inch gauge electric trolley used in Oakland. And I really like all that ornate brass work and all those guys sitting up on top, and they're about 1.5 feet under 600 volts of electricity. I'm not sure what possibly could happen. That car only ran for a few years. Double-deck trolleys were not real common in the United States. The South Pacific Coast Railroad was in California. It started across the bay from San Francisco in a place called Alameda, extended down to San Jose through mostly agricultural lands, and then climbed the hill to go over to Santa Cruz, basically to pick up the lumber traffic and some early industries in that area. Both of the Carter brothers were employed by the South Pacific Coast. Thomas Carter was the car builder, and Martin Carter was the SPC's master mechanic. The South Pacific Coast contract for the rolling stock accounted for about 20 to 25% of what Carter built. And they did locate their shop in Newark, right next to the South Pacific Coast Roundhouse and shops. On the map, you can see also where that was and where Ardenwood Historic Farm, which was along their main line. You'll also notice a short branch line heading from Newark to Centerville, which I'll talk about in a moment. That's definitely part of our story. When the SP purchased the SPC, they transferred equipment, narrow gauge equipment, from the other narrow gauges they had absorbed and standard gauged, like the Oregonian Railway, the San Joaquin and Sierra Nevada, and railroads like that. After standard gauging in 2006, the SP transferred a lot of the SPC rolling stock to Nevada during the Tonopah boom to their subsidiary, the Nevada and California, which later became what we know as the Southern Pacific's narrow gauge. They also sold some equipment to various places like the Northwestern Pacific, the Lake Tahoe Railway, the Butte and Plymouth. About half of the South Pacific Coast still runs today. The line down from Oakland to San Jose is part of the Union Pacific Coast Line, and then Santa Cruz up to Felton, of course, is the standard gauge part of the Roaring Camp railroads. They were a very profitable narrow gauge. They ran a lot of trains. They were well built for the standards of the day. They had a 50-pound rail on the main line, which was pretty close to what some of the standard gauges were using. What I've got here, Dave Adams had in his collection a South Pacific Coast 1901 timetable, and this just shows the commute service out of Alameda and Oakland. And there were 26 commute trains each way. And if you add in about 10 mainline passenger trains, you can see why they had about 70 passenger cars on the roster. This was in addition to their freight business. That Centerville line that I mentioned on the map, what the South Pacific Coast did, instead of ever using a locomotive on it, they hired a local rancher who had horses, and he was contracted to make 3 round trips a day with the little 4-wheel horse car you see in the photo, along with hauling whatever freight was needed over to Centerville. In the photo, you're looking at a very typical Carter 28-foot ventilated boxcar. That would almost be their most typical product. We have seen photos where there's 3 horses and up to 7 or 8 cars in the freight trains. It was flat and level, straight, so there wasn't anything to deal with there. The Patterson Ranch, which became Ardenwood Farm, that had its own little station, which you see over to the right, and we do intend to replicate that at Ardenwood Farm. What's interesting is William Patterson didn't want the railroad because he owned interest in the competing steamboat company, but his wife liked the railroad, and it was her that made the railroad build that little depot and put in a spur for their farm products. The more we researched Carter, the more we started running into the fact that there were a number of other car builders in the Bay Area, which we sort of knew about, but we didn't realize how deep the connections as far as designs, parts, patterns, and even the people migrated between the companies. Kimball was the earliest and was really a wagon manufacturer. They had hoped to get the Central Pacific car contract, but the Big Four decided, let's build our own cars, it's cheaper. So Kimball got work from the Virginia and Truckee, the North Pacific Coast, did a lot of horse cars for San Francisco. Hammond and Holman were mainly standard gauge, along with cable car, trolley car, interurban builders. They did some narrow gauge work after the narrow gauge boom was over. You've all seen Holman cars, but not realized it. The famous little Sierra Railroad Combine 5 and Coach 6 that have been in a lot of movies are Holman cars. Holman was the only builder in the Bay Area that attempted to convert to steel cars around 1910. They got the first order of trolley cars for the San Francisco Muni, built about 20 of them out of about a 40-car order, and went bankrupt. So they were the only one to make the transition. The other thing we noticed was Carter tended to get the first orders, and then Hammond or an East Coast builder would get the second order from the railroad. There also were a number of other smaller car builders in the Bay Area too. And again, lots of common parts from a common foundry. And it does make identifying who built the car oftentimes is questionable until quite a bit of research is done. As I mentioned earlier, when Caboose 47's body was found, and it was a goat pen in the Owens Valley, that was the start of the group. In the lower right, you're seeing a picture of Diamond and Caldor Flatcar number 64, which we salvaged. Original intent was just to take the trucks to use under 47 for display. But one of our model railroaders said, let's take the whole car. And as you can see, we didn't get all the parts and actually had to reassemble parts on the trucks to remove it from the trestle where it had collapsed. It had been left when the DNC abandoned it, and another car had bunkhouses built on them, and people were actually still living in them. Down at the lower left, you'll see our Caboose 47 on the very last South Pacific Coast narrow gauge freight train. This was taken from the platform of the Ag News Depot, which is now a model railroad club, but you'll notice the siding, which is the track where the guy with the bicycle is, that's already been standard gauged. And so all the sidings and yard tracks had been converted, and this basically was the cleanup train. And right behind this, as it's headed north, the gauge was changed. When we go to restore the cars, as I mentioned, we don't get all the parts. And in that top middle photo, you can see a pattern for a wheel and a pattern for some washers. We have to do a lot of pattern making. And all of you as modelers are aware of Grantline's little hardware kits for various cars. Well, we can sell you Carter 28-foot flat and boxcar parts kits if you want to build a real one. In addition to that, we have patterns for a number of other parts, switch stands, etc., that we need for our restoration, and we do make them available to other museums. Another thing that our group did that's a little different than a lot of museums, we are willing to take partial cars, basically, that we know will never be restored, but basically just to get the data and preserve the techniques. And we're always continuing the research, trying to find new sources. Again, a lot of the West Coast narrow gauge cars went through a number of owners, so it does make it a little harder to trace. And then there was this event back in 1906 in San Francisco that burned up a bunch of records and newspapers and references that we would like to have. The railroad operation at Ardenwood Park started, and we ran it with horses until 2015 as a replica of the Centerville branch. None of the South Pacific Coast steam engines exist. And so that was our way of getting the railroad operating. Unfortunately, the cost of keeping the horses and the liability concerns got to be too much. And so we had to replace them with internal combustion engines. And now we're replicating the weekend picnic trains that people would take on the South Pacific Coast, North Pacific Coast, and other railroads. One of the other things that's a little different about our group is we are trying to restore cars to their pre-1900 pre-safety appliance appearance. And that runs into a few problems with operations. There are a lot of cars at various museums built in that era, but they've all been restored much later with the safety appliances. We took it upon ourselves in the last couple of years to apply to the state of California that regulates us and come up with procedures so that we can use accurate link and pin couplers in our environment. And I am happy to say we were approved this year to do that in our limited situation. Their biggest concern, of course, was the safety. And you probably all know how many brakemen in the old days lost fingers. We certainly in today's world can't tolerate that and don't want that with our volunteers. What you're seeing in the lower left-hand photo is our chief mechanical officer explaining to our certified engineer how that procedure is going to work. So currently we have internal combustion power pulling our trains. They're currently being pulled by Katie, a 5-ton Plymouth that was built for the Baraboo, Wisconsin Ordnance Works. And it was rebuilt by our volunteers with a diesel motor about 3 years ago. We also have the Whitcomb over to the right, which is undergoing a complete rebuild. Basically it's reassemble it, and we're hoping to have it running by later this year. We have a lot of special events at Ardenwood. Our rail fair is usually on the Labor Day weekend, which sadly this year conflicts with the narrow gauge convention. We have visiting steam engines that have come in. We have various model railroad displays, everything from Lego to live steam. down at the bottom left, you can see the first steam engine that visited Ardenwood, and it was standard gauge. So we laid 200 feet of dual gauge track and actually ran a dual gauge passenger train for a while. We've had other visiting engines. There's a number of small engines on the West Coast that have come to play. Our Halloween Haunted Train is our largest fundraiser. It's mainly for the kids. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to do that with the COVID situation. We hope to restart that sometime soon. In addition to that, just having multi-generations of a family around to share a hobby with is a wonderful thing. And we've also started doing events for special needs kids, which is really makes a lot of this worthwhile. Well, I know most of you guys are probably interested mostly in the rolling stock we have, so I'll go through this and give you sort of an overview. And one thing in the chat before this presentation, people were talking about what are the colors of paint for some of this older stuff that we only ever see in black and white photos. So I will try to give you some data from the research. We are lucky to have had a couple of people that are very good paint researchers and know the old style paints that have been involved with the group. The Carter Brothers freight cars generally were 24 or 28 foot, 8, 10, 15 ton capacity. So these are pretty much lightweight early cars. They use swing motion trucks on most of their cars. And another thing that's been published and implied in a number of places that I need to shoot down, Carter did not invent swing motion trucks. They were around before and they were around after. Swing motion trucks in their era had a weak point, and what I've been told is Mount Montgomery Pass on the SP narrow gauge and some of the sharp curves on the west side are littered with broken swing hangers when they overloaded the cars or put them under too much stress. North Shore 1725 is set up as a temporary picnic car. In that mode, it would have hauled lumber as a regular flat car for 6 days a week, and on Sundays for the picnic trains, this removable structure and seats would have been put on it and then would have been lifted off, and on Monday it was hauling lumber again. Car 472 has our photos and historical displays inside. It's kind of a museum car. You'll also note the SPC reporting marks, but Southern Pacific Company on the Herald, and that is accurate for the cars that were transferred from other Southern Pacific properties to the SPC. And you'll notice the car color is brown, not boxcar red or some variation of that, and that is the accurate color for SP boxcars in that era. South Pacific Coast Caboose 47, of course, was our first car. It looks like a combine, but it was a Caboose. Probably did handle some local passenger and LCL traffic. What is there is mostly original. It has been completely measured, photographed, and the next decision is going to be whether we restore this or build a replica of it, and that is probably going to be dependent on the condition of the frame members. Interesting point on color, the lowest color we found on this one, you could use rail box yellow if you were doing a model. The car on the right was long thought to be Carter Brothers. Everybody said so, but recent inspection hasn't turned up a single Carter-esque detail on it. We don't know its history. We think it might have been a steam dummy trailer originally. It was saved when it was put on a standard gauge flat car and used as a logging caboose. Then it was saved by a local historian up there in Humboldt County. We're still researching this car. Model railroaders love this. It's a beautiful kit bash. And if you're old enough in the hobby, there was an article by Whit Towers in the mid-60s in Railroad Model Craftsman kit bashing a car, and the prototype he used was this car. when it was on the standard gauge flat car. The NWP Caboose is our current restoration project. We're undoing a 1960s era attempt at restoration. This car should be ready next year. It was built in 1902 in Sausalito by the North Shore, which became the Northwestern Pacific Railroad. It will be painted orange with maroon trim and black trim. And basically, if you wanted to model this, go find a Milwaukee Road modern passenger car, and that's what it'll look like. The number 1010 over on the right was built in 1882 by one of the little short lines, the San Joaquin and Sierra Nevada, which ran near Lodi, California, was originally built as a full coach and then was converted over there to a combine. Again, the Southern Pacific bought out the Little Farmers Railroad and then transferred the car over to the South Pacific Coast, where it ran for a couple of years as SP number 1010, which is how it appears in the photo. That's how it appeared on the South Pacific Coast. It later was transferred over to Nevada. It was wrecked on the Virginia and Truckee, used on the SP narrow gauge. It became a sheep herder's house before it was saved. The photo shows it at the Sacramento Rail Fair in 1999. The car does need a repaint job, but I dare you to build a model of this in its original form. The original color we found for the San Joaquin and Sierra Nevada would be Conrail blue. One of the most historic cars in our collection is the Monterey and Salinas Valley Boxcar. This was actually Carter's first job before they even became Carter Brothers. It had a long history in Nevada, and eventually, as you can see from the gaudy paint job, it became a billboard for a casino near Las Vegas. We built a fake boxcar to trade for it from the casino because they just wanted a billboard. Over on the right is another one of our really historic treasures, Oakland Railroad horse car number 8. The Oakland Railroad was actually owned by the South Pacific Coast, and this car, when they electrified, it became Claremont University and Ferries Railroad in Berkeley, which is the initials you're seeing on the picture. This car was retired in 1902 and became a children's playhouse for some rich person in Berkeley. It was salvaged by a historian in the 1940s and put on parade wheels, but we've put it back on temporary wheels. We do intend to restore it, and we do have patterns for the correct wheels and pedestals. What's really nice about this car is everything above the wheels is 98% original, and that includes the glass, which is generally the first thing these car bodies would lose to slingshots and BB guns. More cars. Well, DNC 64 is that car Hulk that you saw hanging off the cliff in some of the earlier pictures. This is our first passenger carrying car. We got 38 years of service out of it. It's still intact. It needs some refurbishment. Wood doesn't last forever. The box cars you're seeing over to the right are fairly typical Carter products, and the car at the far end was built by Hammond. Again, very similar. As far as we know, it's the last existing piece of rolling stock from the Pajaro Valley Consolidated Railroad, which operated near Salinas, California, and basically was a sugar beet hauling railroad. And at the bottom of the screen, I mentioned a number of other pieces of rolling stock that we have in our collection. And the latest news is just a few weeks ago, we finally, after 40 years of dreaming, have a steam locomotive that now lives at Ardenwood Park. It's owned by 2 of our members, leased to the group. The tender will be coming soon. It was a wood burner through its whole life at Argent and the other logging railroads. We are going to convert it to oil. Anyone who's seen the news in the last decade knows there's a fire danger in California, and since Ardenwood is half eucalyptus trees, there's no way that a wood burner is going to fly. It's a little more modern than anything the South Pacific Coast owned, but it is just about the approximate size of their normal locomotives. So we're very excited. We're probably about 2 years or so away from it being operational. It is basically complete. It does need some refurbishment and the conversion to oil firing. Here's some links for some more information. I would like to offer a special invite to you, since you're all narrow gauge fans. If you want to visit us, contact us first, either via the website, email, or if you know friends who know some of us, because a number of the cars I showed you aren't on public display, but we can give special tours for those that are interested. We'd also love to have you join us. All railroad museums, volunteer organizations need both volunteer labor and contributions. And if you find yourself in the San Francisco Bay Area, be sure to look us up. We'd enjoy having you visit. And thank you for listening.
Thanks, Don. That was very interesting. And thank God for people like you and your group, because you're the ones that do the research that make it easier for us to model any number of different prototypes. And it's nice that somebody's doing something unusual, something a little off the, not DNRGW or RGS. It's interesting to see something a little different.
Did Carter Brothers ever build any true refrigerator cars, i.e. with ice hatches and things like that?
Not that we're aware of. The closest, Hammond, one of the other San Francisco companies, did some insulated box cars for the Tonopah Railroad, which later ended up on the Lake Tahoe Railroad. But as far as we're aware, Carter, actually none of the San Francisco builders built refrigerator cars that I'm aware of. Okay, thank you, Don. The only other things in the chat are people thanking you for the presentation and keep up the good work and things of this sort. So I think with that is thanks a lot for showing up, telling us who you are, and I'll turn this back over to the folks running this show. Okay, thank you guys.